Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Nature-Based Climate Change Adaptation Tools for Coastal Communities. This webinar is part of Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform webinar series, which showcases projects and products available under the Adaptation Platform, the Building Regional Adaptation Capacity and Expertise Program, and the Canada and Changing Climate. These webinars are made possible with support from Natural Resources Canada. My name is John Somerville, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I'm a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada. I'm joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I would encourage you to add your own land acknowledgement in the chat bar. Claire Sanders at the Climate Risk Institute will be available during the webinar if you run into any audio or technical issues. To ask her a question, you can open up the chat box and using the drop-down arrow, locate Claire's name and you can send her a private message. Please note that your microphones have been automatically muted to avoid any audio distractions or feedback during the webinar. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end of each presentation today, but that doesn't mean you have to wait to hold your questions. Please feel free to type in your questions during the presentations in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentations. We are recording the webinar today, and we'll be sending out a link to everyone who is registered, along with a copy of the presentation slides. So the projects and resources presented today were part of an NRCan's Climate Change Adaptation Program call for proposals in 2017. Looking at alternative and innovative options to hard protection infrastructure solutions. This call was informed by priorities established by the Adaptation Platform's Coastal Management Working Group. So now I would like to introduce our speakers today. So we're lucky to have Dr. Danica van Proosty as a professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at St. Mary's University. She's the director and co-founder of Transcoastal Adaptations, a Center for Nature-Based Solutions. She has over 25 years of applied nature-based coastal adaptation experience with vulnerability assessments in Canada, the Caribbean, and the Indian Ocean. Our second presenter today, Dr. Kees Lochman, is Associate Professor and Chair of Landscape Architecture at the University of British Columbia. His research focuses on design challenges related to sea level rise adaptation, water and food shortages, and the energy transition. He directs UBC's Coastal Adaptation Lab, which aims to develop novel planning, design, and policy solutions for coastal adaptation. And on behalf of everyone joining today, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our presenters. So we appreciate them presenting today. And without further delay, we'll turn things over to Danica. Thank you, Danica.
Great, thanks, John. Excellent. So I'd like to begin today by acknowledging that I'm presenting to you in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I would also like to acknowledge my co-authors from Dalhousie and St. Mary's University, particularly co-PIs on the project, Patricia Manuel, Kate Sharon, and Eric Rappaport. Coastal zones are dynamic, and because of the dynamic, they also lead to conflict between this natural variability and the economic, social, and cultural activities within the sector. Nova Scotians love their coast, but climate change is driving the need to reimagine a new relationship with this landscape. One where healthy coastal ecosystems protect against the impacts of climate change, and where development respects dynamic coastal processes. Decision makers need tools to help foster this new relationships, tools that work with nature for long-term resilience of coastal regions. This framework outlines those natural processes and explains how making room for movement by allowing the space for dynamic coastal systems to sustain themselves is an alternative to hard engineering for climate change adaptation. Development of the Making Room for Movement framework was supported by Natural Resources Canada Climate Change Adaptation Program. It was a joint project of Dalhousie University and St. Mary's University, together with industry and ENGO partners. It was multidisciplinary, bringing together planning, coastal geomorphology, engineering, wetland science, environmental stewardship, and communication. by identifying and understanding how drivers for and barriers to implementing nature-based approaches for adaptation at the coast, we can build a framework for effective implementation while increasing awareness of the feasibility of nature-based coastal approaches in the Atlantic region. The overall goal was to build a framework to guide decision makers and practitioners working with local residents, landowners, resource users, and governments to implement nature-based alternatives to hard infrastructure at the coast. Now, what are barriers and drivers? Well, a driver or enabler is a factor or outcome that makes nature-based coastal adaptation more feasible in the eyes of decision makers and influencers. On the other hand, a barrier is a factor, obstacle, or issue that complicates the path to implementing nature-based coastal adaptation. Now, this framework is not a step-by-step guide to designing and implementing nature-based coastal adaptations. These exist in many forms elsewhere, but rather it provides guidance for better aligning planning and decision-making regarding coastal development and resource use with natural systems and processes. Nova Scotia's geology, climate, tidal range, and settlement histories create a really diverse coastal landscape. This diversity of coastal place supports exploring various nature-based coastal adaptation options within the same planning and government's frame context. Although created with the Nova Scotia context, the framework can be relevant for other coastal jurisdictions, particularly in Atlantic Canada, where many of the coastlines are similar to those in Nova Scotia. Now, the framework is built on a foundation, theoretical foundation, stories, and practice. So an in-depth analysis of scholarly literature and technical reports and interviews with local practitioners experienced with using nature-based climate adaptation form the basis for the project-specific investigation of drivers and barriers and structuring a framework for the implementation. These investigations also led to peer-reviewed publications authored by members of the research team. The independent peer review ensures that the framework foundation is solidly built within current international scholarship, best practices, and regional on-the-ground experience. In stories, we collected perceptions and knowledge from professional practitioners' experiences through workshops, surveys, and interviews. We also collected perceptions and knowledge of lived experiences through focus groups with the public in coastal areas. In addition, the research team developed case studies of nature-based coastal adaptation in different coastal contexts around the province. These case studies demonstrate small and large initiatives that include various forms of partnerships and engagements, a willingness to experiment with new techniques and lead by example, and decisions that acknowledge the long-term costs of trying to mobilize a dynamic coast. The case studies both inform the development of the framework and also illustrate it. And the case study reports are available as standalone documents on the Transcoastal Adaptations website. Now, the framework document begins with guiding principles of implementing nature-based coastal adaptation, followed by adaptation approaches aligned with nature-based adaptation called the 5 Rs. The framework then presents the place and governance context and strategies for considering the implementation of NBCA. Case studies of projects around the province provide the locally relevant examples of planning, design, implementation, and managing this new approach to coastal climate change adaptation. Now, we've identified 7 guiding principles that I'm going to be referring to in the following slides with some case examples. Within the guidance document, these are supported by case studies and quotes. The questions are also included of which to consider, and they're intended to get the audience thinking about the various aspects of implementation within the context of their own projects. So the first principle is to build knowledge systems. In 2017, the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, or CMM, Mi'kmaq Conservation Group Artificial Reef Project, was set up to build capacity for coastal management within the CMM member communities, specifically by enhancing marine habitat using reef balls along sections of the Northumberland Strait shoreline. This nature-based approach aligns with traditional Mi'kmaq land and resource management principles. And trust can be built through respecting the local and Indigenous knowledge and cultural traditions and engaging people early and meaningfully in design and management approaches or transition. In the case of the Belcher Street Managed Realignment in Jiji-Wuktuk, this addresses two of the fundamental principles to preserve biodiversity and dynamic processes, as well as restore coastline using natural processes and materials. And in this project, we removed dike infrastructure in a section of dike land, removed an aboiteau, and expanded a channel to allow for reintroduction of tidal flow and natural colonization of tidal wetland vegetation, as you can see in the panels on the right-hand side. Within 2 years, the surface was almost completely vegetated. In addition, inverted root wads were used for erosion control along the banks instead of extensive root rock armoring. Principle number 4, seek ecosystem services co-benefits. The town of Mahone Bay recognized the benefits of using a living shoreline approach to address coastal flooding and erosion and was motivated to make that choice based on these benefits. Benefits include increased protection, habitat creation, aesthetic enhancements, improved public access and recreational opportunities, including a coastal walking trail and pocket beaches. Recent funding by the Intact Foundation for a pilot demonstration project led by the NGO Coastal Action with the CBCL, CBWest, and St. Mary's University. And we're happy to report that construction begins this weekend. Number 5, using a just transition approach. Clean Coasts have collaborated with local communities and Mi'kmaq knowledge holders and embraced a two-eyed seeing approach through the entire process, including site selection, design, and implementation. 3 salt marsh restoration sites were identified. The inclusive process has resulted in increased awareness of the importance of salt marsh habitat and trust between Indigenous and non-Indigenous partners and communities. In addition, the project has resulted in increased cultural competency within the multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral project team. 6, foster shared interest and responsibility. The recently implemented Onslow North River Managed Dike Realignment and Tidal Wetland Restoration Project arose from a shared interest and responsibility. And the project served multiple purposes: as habitat compensation for Nova Scotia Public Works for highway twinning, decreased dike maintenance costs for the Nova Scotia Department of Agriculture, and contribution to the reduction in flooding in the town of Truro, therefore climate change adaptation. In addition, the final principle, avoid maladaptation, should be considered within all of the actions that are taking place within your area. Now, we also look at some of the considerations for implementation by examining those barriers and drivers that we looked at earlier. And these are broken up into 5 primary categories: place context, governance, financing, practitioner engagement, and community engagement. And within these, we identify those barriers and drivers while providing guiding questions to support the implementation. Putting nature-based coastal adaptation into practice requires consideration of place. Coastal place is where land and sea meet, creating a dynamic environment that both challenges and sustains human use and settlement. Implementing nature-based climate adaptation requires understanding the attributes of coastal place, including the geography, ecosystems, landscape histories, and the modern coastal settlements. Strategies for understanding the landscape and settlement patterns where nature-based coastal adaptation is being considered will help to determine the best nature-based options. For it to be successful, it is important to, it is actually critical to choose options that are compatible with the local topography, geology, and dominant coastal processes through coastal landscape analysis. Social and cultural assessments can be employed to understand the history of a place, and this needs to be reviewed for historic settlement patterns, uses, and archaeology before any future modification of the coastline is considered. It is also important to consider the people who live in and use the places where nature-based coastal adaptation is being considered, because they could experience and be affected by those decisions in a variety of different ways. In terms of the governance context, there are tools and strategies of governance greatly influence the evolution of place. Implementing nature-based coastal adaptation requires understanding the coastal governance structure, context, and the use of governance tools and strategies. Some strategies for understanding the people and place governance will help determine the best adaptation options. So we've provided guiding principles and want our audience to compare their own organization's principles to to those provided. The aim is to help them better identify drivers and barriers within their principles in implementing nature-based adaptation. A legislative scan will help identify supporting and contradictory policies, plans, and regulations. Undertaking a policy and planning evaluation will help identify supportive plans, policies, and regulations or impediments to using nature-based approaches. Mapping natural, community, cultural infrastructure assets is a valuable exercise to help understand risks and opportunities for nature-based coastal adaptation and basis of risk assessment. And finally, nature-based adaptation projects in Nova Scotia have been funded either entirely, internally, or externally by a lead organization. Most often, projects are implemented by a combination of funding sources. Engagement involves both practitioner and community. The implementation of nature-based coastal adaptation requires a collective vision of resourceful practitioners, including government officials and societal participants, with the strategic distribution of roles and responsibilities among them. Drivers for implementing nature-based adaptation identified by our team included professional learning, sharing a common working language, trust-based networks, creating and recognizing opportunities, utilizing authority and resources, and distributing roles and responsibility. Community engagement is critical for connecting with the community at large, eliciting their knowledge and experience, and gaining public and political support for nature-based approaches. Engagement enables a two-way conversation and sharing of knowledge, of information between a project team and the water community. And understanding the importance of building trust within a community, understanding how knowledge and experience are often outweighed by people's emotions, finding trusted community leaders, and understanding where conflict has occurred within a community all help to overcome barriers to gain support for nature-based climate adaptation. Now, each section of the framework draws upon multiple aspects of the Making Room for Movement research conducted by our interdisciplinary team members. The framework aims to share stories of Nova Scotians' experience of living and working along the coast, with a focus on experiences with and perceptions of nature-based climate adaptation. Although created within the Nova Scotia context, the framework can be relevant for other coastal communities, jurisdictions, particularly in Atlantic Canada, where many of the coastlines are similar to those of Nova Scotia. The guiding principles are universal. We must also have that increased awareness and consideration of the nature-based adaptation over the duration of the project. But overall, we require reimagining our coastal use of function and envisioning the future, incorporating nature within that future element. And with that, I'd like to, this is a art graphic summary of one of our workshops that was held. And I want to acknowledge NRCan as a primary funder for this work, but additional funding and collaboration with CBCL, CB West, the Ecology Action Center, and Narrative Research. This work would also not have been possible without the hard work and dedication of research associates and student contributors. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danica. That was great. Now we have the chat bar is open. If people have any questions for Danica about the framework or about the process or case studies. But kind of to start us off here, we have a question about sort of what are immediate actions that communities can take to increase the uptake of nature-based solutions that would support these kind of innovative approaches.
So there are a couple of things that can happen. One is increasing awareness of the benefits of the natural assets that we currently have within our communities, and being able to provide those case studies and case examples where the natural asset provides those protective functions. So having people understand and recognize within their local area, areas that are already providing those services. And I think that the next part is really, I think a lot of it comes down to case studies and helping people visualize and reimagining and having different conversations about how we want to adapt to our future. And there's lots of materials that are out there that are being developed regionally, nationally, and internationally to help support those actions.
And we have a question here now on wondering how the coastal adaptations take into account how they may affect coastal food environments, example, shellfish harvesting.
That's a great question. And so as with any approach, any selection of any approach, you have to consider all of the multiple impacts. So the environmental impacts of the action that you're going to be taking in question. So a nature-based approach is no different. So you would have to consider the impact of the potential footprint of your activity and the impacts in the surrounding landscape, similar as you would have to do with any engineering approach as well. And so looking at those, it really depends on the local area in terms of impact, but we should be considering impacts on shellfish in any of the activities that we do within the area, similar to any other projects happening within the coastal zone.
And it's great to hear that Mahone Bay is starting this week.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah.
So we have a question here about maybe you can use the Mahone Bay as an example to answer this question. Was everyone on board, or did you receive some pushback? If so, how did it slow things down, change approaches?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So a series of options were presented to the town, and the nature-based option was the preferred, and the hybrid option was the preferred option that council voted on. Coastal Action has been really great about providing education and outreach to the local citizens. There have been some concerns that were raised, but those are being addressed by responding to concerns, providing answers to their questions, and basically listening and having that dialogue. But generally, there's a lot of support for this project, and it is a demonstration project, and we are hoping to be able to use that to help expand the footprint within Mahone Bay, but also within smaller, similar communities within the Atlantic region.
And we have another question here. It wasn't clear to me the mechanism used for knowledge transfer and engaging with local communities. It seems to have worked well, though. So maybe, yeah, it'd be great. What was the engagement process with communities?
All right, so it happened on a variety of different levels, ranging from a more kind of superficial, well, not really superficial, focus groups that were used to identify and find out what the concerns were of coastal residents within Nova Scotia. There were also we had a community workshop where we brought together folks from around the area to talk about a common issue. In this case, it was the Cornwallis River. The engagement very much it's just with communicating. All of us as part of the project team, we in a non-formal manner engage with local community groups, and through those activities we're able to educate, raise awareness of a lot of these different approaches. So in a way it's more kind of organic and embedded within how we work together within the Nova Scotia context, with NGOs working very closely with academic groups and the private sector as well, and government.
And we have a question that comes up a lot, and people are always wonder about this, how that nature-based solutions are very exposed, and sometimes they're sensitive themselves to climate hazards. What about adding in some alternative engineering style approaches or hybrid approaches? Is that part of the framework?
Absolutely. One of the components when I say about understanding the place-based concept, that's absolutely critical. The type of nature-based approach is a whole continuum of approaches that can be used, and some of the hybrid solutions are going to be very effective and needed and required within your coastal areas. The ideas that you want to, once again, sort of reimagine the possibilities, and it doesn't have to be just a simple blade of grass, but it can be more complex integration of perhaps oyster reefs, or even a harder engineering structure as a breakwater in some capacity to allow for that natural system to be able to be developed behind. And fortunately, recently in this past fall, the Engineering with Nature guidance document was released internationally, which really is provides engineering guidance for the application of natural and nature-based features for flood protection. But they specifically address that concept that it's, a living shoreline on its own is not going to be appropriate in all conditions, and you have to match your approach with the geographic and climatic and geologic conditions of the area.
And maybe we can give a shout out to that guidance as well, and then include it in the chat bar there. Were there any barriers in deciding whose responsibility it was to adapt to the erosion? I find that a major barrier to start working on our shoreline. We should take on what role to start with adaptation measures, or who should take on what role to start with adaptation measures?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And it's a complicated one, and it comes down to, in many cases, sort of jurisdiction, or who's what land, if we're talking about an individual property owner, or we're looking at a municipality or provincial infrastructure. So it really comes down to who actually has ownership or action of actions on the land itself, because modifications are going to be needed on that particular area. But it is challenging, particularly if you have a group of coastal residents, for example, perhaps cottage owners, and you have erosion taking place, and one homeowner may decide to put a lot of riprap down, which causes accelerated erosion on the downdrift side of their neighbor, and sometimes an updrift as well. And so there becomes a lot of conflict. But that is where, once again, looking at the community level and having conversations within a coastal section or coastal reach becomes very, very beneficial. And it is an approach used in Europe to try to mitigate erosion in particular.
Well, thanks, Danica. That was great. I think we got through a good variety of questions there. That was really interesting. Maybe we'll turn to Case now, and so he has enough time to present. And if there's further questions for Danica, we can bring everyone back at the end for more questions. So thanks, Danica, and we'll turn things over to you, Case.
Thank you, John. Thanks, Claire. Thanks, Danica, for that presentation. It was great. So just starting off by acknowledging that I'm calling in from UBC, which is situated on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, and that much of the work that I've been involved in is situated within the Coast Salish territories. I also wanted to acknowledge that this work, which was funded by NRCan under the title Living Breakwaters, was done in collaboration with Tuchu Conker, Calvin Tan, Benjamin Harper, and Frank Hengler. So what I'll talk about is a project overview. The project that I'm focusing on is primarily looking at challenges in the Fraser River Delta, but very similar to Danica. Many of the issues that I'll be sharing and addressing, are issues that we'll see across coastal areas all over the world. So a lot of the findings and recommendations are transferable. I'll talk a little bit about the changing coastline platform, including the map browser we've developed, as well as time-based narratives, and as well as a database of adaptation strategies. From there, I'll talk about where we are now. Unlike Danica's, ours is not fully developed yet, so we have some wrinkles to address, but some of that might, I could use your help with, so that's great. And then I have some closing comments. So the Living Breakwaters, when it was awarded in 2018, had these two overarching objectives: to advance flood adaptation knowledge in the lower mainland and beyond, and to develop solutions for erosion of the Point Grey Cliffs here at the unceded territories of the Musqueam, UBC, in an area that's managed with by Metro Vancouver. For the purposes of this presentation, I'll only focus on area 1 because I wouldn't be able to get through in depth what we've done for point 2, but I'd be happy to follow up on that with anyone that's interested. So talking a little bit about the delta here, the Fraser River Delta, you know, we are already very urbanized, but there is a projection of another 1 million people over the next 20-25 years. There's a very complex jurisdictional environment, which includes 25 municipalities, First Nations, as well as quasi-governmental authorities like the port and the airport that occupy coastal areas. It's an incredibly important region in terms of the Pacific Flyway for migratory fish and juvenile salmon, herring, and sturgeon. And reports have addressed that already 102 species are at risk of local extinction due to urbanization, and that the risk of sea level rise and climate change will only further exacerbate this. In terms of flood vulnerability, we're mostly relying here on dikes. And as we've seen with the floods in the recent floods of November, but also with the king tide that happened in January, they're very vulnerable. Many of them don't actually meet provincial dike heights and design standards, and it will require a lot of money to update and reinforce these dikes. And I think, as Danica has outlined, is in many instances that's not what we want to do. We want to look for nature-based solutions or hybrid solutions. So there's really a need for a paradigm shift here. And that's, I think, what this project is trying to help with, is building knowledge, you know, around what are the options that we have, but also how vulnerable are we, who is vulnerable, where is this vulnerability, and how can we communicate cascading effects. A lot of people always think like you're only impacted if you're in the floodplain, but as we've seen with the floods here in just in November, is that flooding will impact way beyond the area that's immediately impacted. So the platform is, you know, has a series of elements. It has a map browser, a time-based interactive narratives, a visual database of adaptation strategies, and it's building exemplary case studies. To start with the map browser, at the time we started doing this research, there was no place that actually had you know, all this data in one location where people could go and see different flood projection scenarios, as well as how certain land use patterns might be impacted. So the goal was really to highlight the impact of these different flood scenarios on infrastructures, institutional buildings, etc., as well as highlight social vulnerability and ecological vulnerability. So I'll play this little clip, which is taken just me browsing through the website, but here I'll just show that this is slightly changed now. We've called it themes, but we've grouped some of the data in different themes, just to make it a little bit easier for those interested in, for example, vulnerability of logistic networks, of cultural landscapes, which includes parks and archaeological sites, utility systems, and then food security. So you can select one of those themes, and it will load, you know, the kind of the layers that are associated with that. The map has a feature that you can pan in different directions. You could just take the top view, or you could zoom in. You're able to add different layers if you would like to, because you know, we want to make it as user-friendly as possible. You can select different flood scenarios, and these flood scenarios were developed by the Fraser Basic Council. And since we've kind of developed this website, they've updated their flood scenarios, so we're hoping to incorporate them as well. And you're also able to zoom in, you know, to kind of really see how it might affect specific areas of your municipality. And then in the end, you're able to kind of select areas and download data or print screens. And so The goal of this website, of this browser, is really to kind of provide a base knowledge of information and make this available for anyone that wants to get started. And ideally, we want to bring in a function that allows local municipalities to add their own layers and data sets into this. In terms of the time-based interactive narratives, we've provided 4 narratives in total. They're focusing on the same themes that I just mentioned, so logistical networks, food security, utility systems, and cultural landscapes. And they develop interactive and dynamic graphics to enable to communicate, the cascading effects. And so I'll show you again how we've set this up. So here you can see we have taken kind of a prototypical section of an area here in the lower mainland where you would see kind of agricultural land behind the dike, and then a kind of intertidal area. Here's a saltwater wedge. And so we're basically having this slider at the bottom that shows the current state, what will happen with sea level rise, how a rain event with sea level rise, how that might impact, and then how sea level rise and a storm surge might impact if nothing was done. So again, you're able to move the slider. As you're sliding, things become red that are being impacted. You're able to click on all the items that are red. A pop-up box will show, for example, here, we're seeing coastal squeeze. And within that, you can move to the next state and show what the impacts might be. And sometimes some of these pop-ups also include links to newspaper articles or to journal articles for more information. So really it's trying to educate everyone that, that this is a really complex situation, that there's a lot of different impacts related to flooding, and that, they're all interconnected and should be kind of understood and as such. So again, these different narratives, we've done 4 of them for the different themes. We're building out that knowledge, and we're hoping that this website and platform can be co-managed, and we can update information as more knowledge becomes available. And then we also developed a database of adaptation strategies, and I think it's great to kind of see kind of the relationship with what Danica just presented. Ours is more like a toolbox. And I think the great thing about the kind of how the toolbox get implemented is that it's not just a one solution fits all, but that it's often kind of a mix of different things. We used our organization, we used the PARA framework, protect, accommodate, retreat, and avoid, to visualize these different strategies. We're providing information on these different strategies, including benefits and constraints. And for each of the strategies we're using, or we've provided a national and international case study. So on the website, you'll see this within the adaptation strategies. We've kind of, you're able to kind of search within the different categories of protect, accommodate, retreat, and avoid. Within that, there's a short description of what the adaptation strategy is, and then you can click on them and learn more. Part of the platform is that we want to visualize the implications, the spatial implications of these adaptation strategies, and to also convey how they might change over time. So for all of them, you're able to move. So first of all, you're able to see the current situation, what causes the erosion, and then, for example, if beach nourishment is implemented, what happens over time, and how that helps with creating, in this instance, an increased beach profile that will help with wave attenuation and prevent erosion. Then the description includes different types of beach nourishment, the benefits of it, and the challenges. And then, as I mentioned, we've included kind of exemplary projects, international and local, with links and citations to each. From here, users are able to kind of move between different adaptation strategies. So whether it's protect, accommodate, retreat, or avoid. And all of them are organized in a similar fashion. So here you're seeing options for dry flood proofing by building on stilts or watertight facades or building on mounds, and then again showing with simple graphics of what the implications are of these strategies if implemented. We've also put together kind of a global precedence report. So this is basically the same information of what I just showed in terms of the adaptation strategies, but just in a PDF format. And I don't know, I think, I don't know if we have uploaded it to the website yet, but otherwise I can work with John and make that available as well. So where are we now with the platform is we're providing finishing touches. As you're maybe browsing through, there's some Latin text still on there. So we're just cleaning some stuff up. We're in process of sending out user surveys. And it would be great if I could send some of you this survey to kind of understand how user-friendly it is and if there's information missing. And then, I think it's trying to understand how we can add more examples to as Danica mentioned. I think it's something that provides a lot of information of lessons learned. And then ideally, we're looking for a partner organization that can co-host this platform, which will be able to kind of reach a broader audience as well. In terms of, I think, part of, if I look back at the project and including the second part of the project, which was really focused on developing these solutions for the Point Grey Cliffs, there's a range of things that came to mind. Is that we need to develop new funding mechanisms to promote alternative flood adaptation solutions. Many of the funds available, they apply to kind of hard infrastructure, but it's really hard to find funding sources that promote nature-based solutions and also enable that in terms of a regulatory regime. There's a need for experimentation and adaptive management, as I think some of the questions were already addressed. That I think experimenting with nature-based solutions requires monitoring and all sorts of different things that we need to test those out in different contextual conditions in order to understand how they operate and learn as we go. There's additional coordination to update regulations and bylaws for the implementation of alternative and nature-based solutions. There's a lot of strategies needed to meet the supply and demands of new materials. So, there's need for sediment, plants, and oyster reefs, etc., that are going to be incorporated. And if we're looking at the scales that we're going to be applying them or potentially applying them just in this region alone, we might not have the appropriate kind of setup to make sure we have enough materials. And then there's a shift in education, training, and capacity building to make sure that consultants and everyone is able to promote, plan, design, implement, and monitor alternative and nature-based solutions. And finally, I really appreciated, I think, Danica's points about engagement. And I think it's really important to understand that the projects that we're involved in, they're really based around values. So we need to shift our values, not to only protect our kind of settler capitalist tendencies to kind of look at infrastructure and properties, but we also have to understand that our coastal ecosystems are critically important for coastal livelihoods and for our more than human friends. So we really have to try to understand who is the project with and for, who is doing the research, how are we engaging people, and how are we making sure that those without a voice are being foregrounded as well, and what are the types of outputs we're producing and who will benefit from the knowledge that's produced. So in closing, I think it's great to have received the funding from NRCan and the work that they've been doing to promote, I think, this idea that we're in a paradigm shift and we need to really think about integrated and multi-benefit solutions. We need to foreground First Nation leadership, balance the interest of flood risk with ecosystem recovery, and think beyond dikes and seawalls and promote multi-benefit and nature-based solutions. And with that, I wanted to thank NRCan for this opportunity to present, but I also wanted to acknowledge that part of the project couldn't have been possible with the help of Green Shores, with Pacific Institute of Climate Solutions, and UBC Campus and Community Planning. And with that, I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, so that was a fantastic presentation, and we've been getting some comments in the chat bar here of interest in the survey you mentioned. So maybe in the email where we send out the slide decks and the recording, we can include a link to the survey as well, and also share your email addresses if people want to follow up one-on-one. But we do have a good question to start us off here. Are you thinking of also providing narratives regarding the opportunities of coastal adaptation, working with nature, for example, like reconnection of people with the water and nature, working with Indigenous communities, and is very central to the ongoing sea-to-city design competition, recreation opportunities. Sometimes the positives are better received than the risks.
Yeah, that's a great point, and yeah, I think that would actually be fantastic to do. I think communicating how these nature-based solutions work and their positive impacts and their kind of multi-benefits, I think showing that over time, I think is actually a great idea. The NRCan project is really kind of continuing as part of a funded project through PICS, the Living with Water project, and we're actually working with Sea2City and the city of Vancouver, and so actually, we're also working with the Living Dike pilot project in Surrey and other projects as well. So I think there's great opportunities to use the same style of animation and visual representation to communicate that. So thank you for the suggestion.
Thanks, guys. We have another one here. I'm looking forward to exploring the website and especially all the adaptation examples. Do you face any challenges in finding information on these cases? Anything you wish was more available?
Yeah, I think often cost, for example, is hard to track. It's something to, yeah, I think we would probably need much more kind of interviews with those that were much more closely involved in those projects to kind of understand that. I think also timeframes, challenges and barriers in terms of, like, I just listed things like materials and access to these sites, as particularly if you're working in sensitive coastal ecosystems and you're trying to implement other solutions alongside what's there already. I think access to these sites and implementation is something that I wish we had more information about. Yeah, there, and I think many of the examples that we're looking into, and Danica showed a few, they're either currently underway or they've just wrapped up. So I think there's a little information as of yet published on many of the newer projects that have been implemented. So those were some of the challenges we dealt with, for sure.
And I guess how is success being measured in your projects? And can you say anything about identifying unintended maladaptations, and if there should be contingencies baked into approaches, example, in future funding to address these?
Yeah, that's a great point, and Danica can chip in as well if she wants to. Yeah, I think for us the success would be, I think, once we kind of really launch the website, is to try to understand like how many people are looking into it and getting feedback on the survey, etc. It's like how it can be used and how we can tailor the information so that we can get a base level of understanding for those involved in decision making that might not be super familiar with all of this. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of people for which this website that have studied and learned about this or have been involved with this for 10, 20 years that there's maybe not so much new information on this website, but I think we're trying to kind of elevate the base level of education so that we can enhance these conversations moving forward. Yeah, I think the other question, I'm trying to think about what, there was a second part of the question. With funding, I think I didn't point it out in the last slides that I had. I'll put it up one more time here. I'll pull this up from the disaster financial assistance for local communities. And so some of the things that I think is what we all need to work on is that, for example, DFA, for example, only funds to rebuild things back the way they were, right? And, you know, I think if we're seeing major flooding, I think rather than giving First Nations and municipalities money just to build back the way they were, it will just amplify the status quo and it won't reduce any risk. So we have to change our kind of funding criteria to actually allow municipalities to be proactive and actually integrate different solutions if they would want to as part of their rebuild. So we're building back better instead of building back the same way, which as we're seeing is not going to work, especially with the implications of climate change.
And the social aspects and planning are just as important as the implementation. And we have a question here on how are you aware of any initiatives to help build organizational adaptive capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know there's the Climigration Network. I can put it in the chat after. It's, for example, that this is a network that helps and provides ideas to how to engage communities and groups around issues of managed relocation or a long-term relocation, and those things are like touchy subjects and they're complex, and so, for example, that Climigration Network has provided a guidebook, for example, to build capacity within communities to talk about these issues, and they also help with the facilitation of workshops, etc., around that topic. That's one that comes to mind immediately. I don't know if Danica has an example.
Well, in terms of institutional capacity or organizational capacity, certainly the region of the BRACE programs through NRCan have been building capacity. I know in the Nova Scotia context with the Climate Leadership Program that they're working both within government departments, but then also bringing in key stakeholders within archaeology and a variety of other sectors to do that. So that is certainly one aspect that is being implemented. And I believe it's also go ahead.
Go ahead. No. Okay. Yeah. In our own research, I think what we've done in shifting for the PICS project, for example, we have added line items to make sure that First Nations communities, for example, we have funding so we can actually pay staff members and community members to participate in conversations. So, you know, because that's often a piece that why they're unable to participate is they're overwhelmed and overtaxed, and if there's no funding for it, it's just even harder. So that's another way of just providing funding to make sure there's capacity. Either they can hire additional people, or they can make sure that existing staff and community members that are sharing their knowledge and experience are compensated for their time.
I know now with the Green Shores program, they have a professional level and they're training professional or people with a professional designation to become Green Shores certified. Are there enough professionals to implement this work across Canada if demands increase, or is that a gap as well?
I can jump in on that one. There certainly is a gap. There is increasing awareness within the professional organizations, and as you mentioned, Green Shores is a good example of that. But yes, right now we are facing a shortage of practitioners that are trained in implementing it, although that is growing with a lot of growth happening on the West Coast for sure. But there's definitely need for education, awareness of this as a career, viable career. So working with youth and helping them see the potential of this as a future career.
I can definitely say also from an educational standpoint, I mean, I'm a landscape architect, so not directly, I would say, into the kind of the coastal engineering, but there's a lot of landscape architects working directly on this project, on projects of kind of coastal adaptation. And there's so much interest and energy from students. So I am hopeful that I think there, if there's a gap now, that I think it won't be for long, because I think if the work is there and if we're kind of really pushing for these opportunities, there's so many people interested in and concerned and wanting to experiment with these solutions that I'm hopeful we can get there.
Maybe I'll pivot a bit here to a question about kind of the iterative approach to adaptation and how people might start with a protection approach, knowing that long term they have to retreat. Do your frameworks allow for those kind of discussions around different pathways and making decisions in the short term that leave options open for the long term?
Within the framework's guidance is provided about that, particularly within thinking of sort of that longer term strategy. But as I mentioned earlier, ours is not necessarily a how-to, but providing questions for consideration and options. But certainly thinking at different levels of response is something that is integrated and should be integrated as we look to the future.
Yeah, I think ours in some ways does less of that, because I think it's more like a toolbox of options. And I think we provide obviously caveats. It's not so much that you can just pick one. And I think all the pieces that Danica actually provided about understanding context, place, and ways in which the coastal processes are working are the things that we're mentioning on our website as well. But yeah, I think it's part about kind of understanding the incentives and the engagement with the community, and understanding that in a lot of the situations, especially the coastal situation, it's not that you have to move tomorrow. When it relates to sea level rise, there's, this can be planned over a longer period of time. It's maybe a little bit different along riverine areas where you're dealing with freshets and kind of seasonal fluctuations of high water levels, that some of the decisions might be more urgent, as we're seeing here in conversations around Abbotsford and Summits Prairie and Lake. And so, yeah, I think it's a willingness to engage. I think that's where it starts with. And then I think if there's funding and incentives and other types of things that are aligned to make this conversation a little bit more easier, then I think it might become an option that's not so vilified in the future.
A big thank you both to Danica and Case for your work on these projects and presenting today. Lots of interesting discussion, and we'll look forward to see where this work goes in the future.